We are so fortunate to have two national experts on assessing educator dispositions. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Gina Almerico. Dr. Almerico is a full-time professor and the acting director of participation programs at the University of Tampa, Florida. I would also like to welcome Dr. Sally Ingles, who is an educational consultant on national accreditation standards and policies for educator preparation programs, both domestically and internationally. So let's begin with the first question. My first question to our panelists is, how would you define educator professional dispositions? And Sally, if I might ask you to begin.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome everyone. The way I define dispositions, it's really a blend of what I recall learning from NJACTE several decades ago, and also Linda Darling Hammond. And my definition is a combination of those two, which is dispositions are habits of action in mind, rooted in beliefs and values, as observed in behaviors of candidates with caregivers, colleagues, and community members. So if I may say it more quickly this time, Karen, dispositions are habits of action in mind, rooted in beliefs and values, as observed in our candidates' behaviors with others around them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
When I was looking for a definition, and hi everybody, I'm Gina. When I was looking for a definition of dispositions, I scoured all the research and I noticed that there was a lot of similarity in how they were defined. And the one I kind of landed on is very similar to what Sally just shared. It's Villegas and her work in 2007. And what she said is that dispositions are an individual's inclination to act in a particular way under particular circumstances based on personal beliefs. So when I define dispositions to my candidates, my teacher candidates, I tell them it's a person's values and beliefs that are influencing their behavior. And all of this is manifested through their performance. So that's something they can kind of grasp and understand, values and beliefs that influence your behavior. And then we just watch you do it.
Thank you. My second question is, why is it important to assess educator dispositions? And maybe Gina, you can start this time.
Thank you, I will. There's so many reasons. And what I tried to do was narrow it down to 3 specific reasons why it's important to assess educator dispositions. In 2017, Tamman, Colburn, and Karp noted that high quality teaching is not solely linked to academics. And we know this as educators. They identified 3 components of high quality teaching. I like to think of it as 3 parts to the teacher efficacy equation. So those 3 parts are this: there's subject matter knowledge, there's pedagogical knowledge, and there's professional dispositions. So backing up to that equation, knowing what it takes to be an effective teacher, let's start with subject matter knowledge and skills. These are the types of things that we are teaching in our courses that students are demonstrating, candidates are demonstrating in their critical task, and on our state licensure exams. Pedagogical knowledge would be examples of things like knowing learning theories. Why do we do what we do in the classroom? There are theories that guide our practice. Also, how to differentiate instruction, that's part of the pedagogical knowledge and skills. Designing engaging instructional activities for our students. Creating learning environments conducive to meaningful learning. Creating, implementing, assessing formative and summative evaluations. So those 2 components, the first 2 components of the teacher efficacy equation, have been the focus of teacher research for years. And because of that, there have been measures and tools created to assess these 2 components of high quality teaching. But then there's that 3rd component, professional dispositions. And that's what kind of caught my research. What are they? How do we define them? How do we develop them? And importantly, how do we assess them? So a significant part of preparing highly qualified teachers is to ensure that they possess not only those first two components of high quality teaching, but also to ensure that they possess the important dispositions required to succeed in our field. So that's number one. Secondly, another reason that it's important to assess dispositions because of the most current research in social emotional learning and culturally responsive teaching and educational neuroscience. They all point to the importance of teachers having the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, and the dispositions to ensure high levels of learning and the personal development of their students. We know through the research that our students learn better and learning takes place best in environments where students feel like they're safe. They're in a safe learning environment where they have positive relationships with their teachers and their peers. So it's important to promote and cultivate proactively building these healthy relationships with our students so that they can have positive impacts on student learning. And then third, much of what's expected in teacher preparation today when it comes to dispositions is related to and has direct implications with a program approval and program accreditation. So at both the state and national levels, we are asked to look at our students' dispositions, teach dispositions, and assess dispositions. Those are the three important areas that I think of when I think of why do we assess dispositions.
Mhm.
Thank you, Gina. Sally?
Gina, I want to echo everything you said there. I fully agree. And I'm thinking back to my dissertation research when I came upon numerous studies where previous studies prior to mine indicated that a candidate's dispositions were more predictive of their performance in the classroom than their GPA or their standardized test score. And though I think as educators, we know that in our gut, but it was shocking to see it in print that research really said it's who our candidates are as human beings, which is a greater impact in the classroom than their pedagogical knowledge or their subject matter knowledge. Another set of studies I'm thinking of, and I believe it was a meta-analysis, but studies indicating that P12 schools consider a candidate's disposition actually subordinate or more important when making a hiring decision than even the content knowledge. And yet another reason that we in higher ed must be laser focused on this dispositional assessment because our P12 partners are counting on us to do that.
Thank you both. My next question is a two-part question. What is an effective way to assess candidates' dispositions, and how can we ensure that the instrument is valid? So, Sally, would you like to begin us this time?
Sure. Well, I know Gina and I both have different instruments we've used in higher ed for some time. The instrument that I used was truly developed before me in Haifa, Israel, by Dr. Zafora Sheckman. And what she did is she constructed a group assessment procedure where she placed candidates in a circle and she watched them interact with one another as she took them through a very carefully articulated script. And through that script, she listened to the candidates as they made difficult decisions on social issues and educational issues. She not only was listening to what they said, but how they said that. And her instrument was validated back in the early 80s, and I've just watched its progression for several decades. So that was the group assessment procedure, and that's something that I'm familiar with. And Karen, I'm sorry, I forgot the second question.
How can we ensure that the instrument is valid?
Oh, go to the literature. That's what I would say. Unless you want to conduct your own validity studies, which certainly we can do in higher ed, there are tools that have already been created for us. So go to the literature and make certain you are anchored in an instrument that has research that validates it as a tool for dispositional assessment.
Excellent. Thank you. Gina.
I agree with everything that Sally just said, and her method of assessing dispositions is phenomenal. And it's important for EPPs to institute a system for assessing and monitoring dispositions of our teacher candidates. So whether you're creating your own or finding one that's out there, it's important that we look at the research and we involve subject matter experts to help us, our stakeholders to help give us some input to the tools that we are using. But I wanted to share with you a couple of really good resources if you decide that you want to do this on your own, because my colleagues and I developed a disposition assessment tool back in 2010, and we've been working on it and refining it, and we have it to a place now where we're really proud of it. But a couple of the resources that we used and that I recommend you use is first, and I know that many of you are not working toward CAPE accreditation or CAPE accredited, but back in 2016 and in 2017, CAPE created an evaluation framework. They called it the CAPE Evaluation Framework for EPP Created Assessments. And in this framework, it's a nice little rubric where they delineate what they're looking for in assessment tools. And they identify different categories where they're looking, and they identify whether or not the tool itself would perform at the below sufficient level, the sufficient level, or the above sufficient level. And they evaluate it and they look at it. So we use that wonderful rubric resource to help us refine our tool once we got it created. But the first place we went in creating our disposition tool was where I would recommend that you would go as well, would be in a manual that's published by AERA, APA, and NCME. And it's called Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. And that is the manual to go to whenever you're creating tools that you want to make sure are psychometrically work well. And so what I would want to continue to say is that it's very important to develop or use a method of assessing dispositions that is psychometrically sound. Because once you have a tool that's both valid and reliable, then it holds up to any kind of scrutiny or any kind of issues that may come your way if someone tries to challenge you. It's also important when you are creating a tool or looking to use a tool that your dispositional tool is aligned to standards in our discipline. So I would recommend that when you are creating a tool, look at aligning your tools, or if you're looking at adopting a tool, look at adopting a tool that's aligned to the NTAS standards. Because NTAS, of course, is the standards of expectations and excellence in teacher prep. So I would recommend that. I would also recommend that when you look at starting to assess candidate dispositions, that your faculty needs to understand this. They need to be trained in how to use the tool, and you need to conduct calibration exercises. So all of these things are really, really important, because dispositions are a construct. They are somewhat ambiguous and vague. So you really need to do your homework. You really need to look at the research. There are good tools out there, but if you want to start constructing your own, my recommendation would be to use the resources I just shared and to dig through the research.
Thank you both again. So Sally, I'm going to begin with you, and this is a multiple part question, and it really has to do with timing. When should dispositions be assessed? What are the implications of assessing early in a program? Is it better to wait until the candidate has reached a later point in the program to begin assessing dispositions?
Okay, thank you, Karen. I love this question because I immediately think of early and often. When should we measure dispositions early? If you go back to the definition of disposition, if we believe dispositions are habits of action in mind, habits can be changed, and habits change with time if we change our behaviors. So the earlier that we can help the students self-assess their own dispositions and give good feedback based on valid tools about the dispositional behaviors we see, that gives us the opportunity to come alongside the candidate and work with them to help them shape and grow and develop. And so what are the implications? The implications that either candidates will self-select out of the profession and say, boy, I don't think this is a good fit for me. Or they'd say, I'm really called to this profession. I see I need to change my habits. And so those are the implications, and in my estimation, they're very positive.
Thank you. Gina.
We know that a fundamental task for all of us in teacher prep is that of tracking, monitoring, and assessing candidate performance as they progress in our coursework and in the field. So, of course, we're not only tracking, monitoring, and assessing candidates' pedagogical and subject matter content knowledge, we're also doing this with the dispositions. So there's a couple of recommendations I'd like to make. When should dispositions be assessed? One of my jobs at the University of Tampa is that of Director of Program Review, where I am constantly working with program accreditation, review, reporting, and the like. And as part of our quality assurance system, we have identified transition points or checkpoints throughout our program where we are tracking, monitoring, and assessing candidate performance, both in the classroom and in the field. And so with dispositional assessment, we recommend through our research, 3 specific transition points, a minimum of 3 specific transition points to assess candidate dispositions formally. And one would be at the selection point. So when candidates apply into your program, you would use this disposition assessment as one of multiple pieces of evidence to look at the candidate's performance and make an informed decision. It's great to have multiple pieces of evidence at multiple points in time. So that would be the first time as part of the selection process. You would have trained faculty assess these candidates, and then you would make those decisions in your program. Around midway through, after they've been accepted into your program, they've done some clinical work, they've done a lot of classroom work, it's time to assess again. And then the third formal assessment using any kind of tool that you would use would be toward the end to assure that these candidates do indeed possess these important dispositions that will help them succeed as a teacher. So those are the formal programmatic checkpoints that I would recommend, at least 3. Some people do less, some people do more, but I recommend at least 3. But then what Sally talked about is so important. And I would recommend informally to have candidates be introduced to your assessment of dispositions and to the concept of the importance of dispositions, very first class they ever take in your program. So in our situation, we're a 4-year institution at UT. We would recommend that this is started in the very first introduction to education coursework, where students see the tool, they understand what the tool is about, and they do a self-assessment, actually using the tool. And then that self-assessment is so important, it's so essential, because it gives candidates an opportunity to think about their own views, their own values, their own beliefs, and their own dispositions. They can reflect then on factors that have influenced them to think the way they do and to influence the values that they hold. And then they can consider how prepared they are to embrace what research tells us is needed to be a teacher in the field. Do I have what it takes? Will my values positively or negatively impact the children I'm planning to teach? Are these habits of mine that I've formed, are they going to be ones that will lead me to succeed in my profession and help my children learn? So all of this self-reflection needs to start early on in the program where students are very aware of the dispositions. So that way they know what's going to be expected of them and they can aim toward developing those dispositions.
Thank you. The next question, I think, is going to be a very interesting one, and I'm really waiting to hear your answers on this. And it's a little bit substantive, so I will read it slowly.
Okay.
Dispositions assessments may provide the reason teacher candidates are asked to leave the educator preparation program. Please provide some cases of using educator disposition assessments that have prompted difficult decisions, have helped remediate dispositions, and/or have ultimately led to candidates becoming successful educators in their field. Gina, would you like to start us?
Okay, yes, I would. All right, so going back to that teacher quality equation that I shared at the beginning with the 3 components of effective teaching. It's much more straightforward to assess the knowledge, and it's much more straightforward to assess the pedagogical skills. We do that in our critical tasks. And like I said, we do it in our final exams, our midterm exams, and our teacher certification exams. But these things called dispositions, oh my goodness, they tend to be more abstract. They are constructs and they can be construed various ways. So it's very, very important, first and foremost, to have a valid and reliable tool to use when you are making assessment of candidate dispositions. And it's funny, the funny thing about dispositions in the classroom is that you know the appropriate demonstration of dispositions when you walk in and see it. You're going into your classroom as a college professor and you're working with your students, or you're going in as a university supervisor and you're watching your students teach, and you know it. You know it when your students nail it. They have these dispositions. It's obvious. It's just that gut feeling. Defining them is important because you also get that really strong gut feeling when those dispositions are not there or when they're off. So it's crucial to have a process in place using a valid and reliable tool when you are assessing candidate dispositions. Again, I think it's very important to introduce the assessment of dispositions and the reason that you're doing this in your first education course, so candidates can read about dispositions, so they can watch films about teaching and look at the different dispositions that the teachers in these films are playing and the ones that they possess. They can role play different dispositions and engage in learning about them, because the better students know what the dispositions are and the more that they can acknowledge that you have a process in place, the better you are in moving forward and doing these dispositions. So one of the things I would recommend that you do is in your application process, you have in there a statement where the student signs it or checks it and says, I understand and I acknowledge the disposition assessment process used in this program. That's something that we implemented years ago, because what we have found is that often when we have students who are struggling or who have challenges, it tends to be more dispositionally. So this leads me to the next thing. When indeed there is a dispositional concern, I talked about earlier, when you have a good disposition tool, a valid and reliable tool that you use, that you should formally use it programmatically at certain checkpoints. But this tool is also one that could be used and should be used whenever there's a student of concern. So if you have a university supervisor, cooperating teacher, college professor, anyone who's working directly with this student and knows this student has a concern, they should be able to complete the disposition assessment and submit it to someone there at your institution. And that's why it's important to have a clearly articulated, defensible, and fair process for dealing with candidate dispositions, especially when you are intervening with a student whose dispositions are not being effectively demonstrated in the classroom. And so have we had that happen at our institution? Yes. And what happens is when we have a candidate who has had, and typically it's not during these checkpoints where we catch it. The checkpoints seem to be, okay, they're progressing. It seems to be incidences that happen that professors bring to our attention, or cooperating teachers or university supervisors bring to our attention, that we have a concern here. This concern has been going on now for a couple of weeks. I've tried to work with this candidate. I've met with this candidate, but we need some help. So at our institution, and what we recommend is that you have some type of committee where when you have a student who is demonstrating a need for help with dispositional development, you call the candidate in to the committee, and this is what we do. And we meet with this candidate. We talk about the dispositional concern. The candidate talks with us about the dispositional concern. And together, we create an intervention or remediation plan with this candidate. We all sign off on it, and the candidate works toward, we support the candidate to work toward improving dispositionally. When we have not had success, we have a paper trail. We have it documented that we've met with this candidate. These are the interventions we have implemented. We have worked with this candidate, and the candidate understands that if indeed these dispositions are not improved, we will reconsider this candidate's progress in our program. What typically has happened, and what the research actually shows us, is that when we have candidates who are consistently giving dispositionally giving us challenges, oftentimes they self-dismiss. And that happened in our program several times. We would have candidates, we'd call in, we'd work with these candidates, and we have even tried to figure out, how many times do you call this candidate in? How many times do you allow this candidate's disposition to be something that brings them in for intervention? And that's a sticky wicket. But the good thing is, if you have a valid and reliable tool and a good, fair process, it works in your favor.
And
Thank you,
Gina,
Gina.
I'm going to
Sally.
echo what you said. Thank you. That formal process using the valid and reliable instrument has been the key in the previous institutions where I've worked. And also your observation about self-selection. I served as a director of teacher candidate induction in one teacher education program. And that meant I worked with the candidates to inform them about their admission status. So how did they perform on the admission dispositional assessment, and how were they performing in other ways? And it was very interesting for me to see as an observer, if a candidate received news that said there are growth areas and they would not yet progress, I was stunned at how many students would say to me, you know, I'm only in this program because my second grade teacher said I'd be a great teacher. Or my mom really wants me to be a teacher, but I want to be a therapist. So it was fascinating how I, sitting in the front seat, could hear so many candidates almost breathe a sigh of relief when I could sit down with them and say, this is what we're seeing. Do you want to work on it? And many would self-select out. But let's talk about the students who said, no, I want to persist. This is really my calling. I was the director of teacher candidate induction. So that meant I would work with a candidate to devise a program improvement plan, or a PIP, a professional improvement plan. And it was so gratifying to watch the students flourish, grow, change, develop, generate their own evidence that they had been placed in local schools and they were practicing these behaviors that were no longer hidden curriculum. They learned that effective teachers are warm and engaging. And so they could practice that week after week. And I can recall a number of students who finished the program successfully because of the early intervention, because of the professional improvement plans. So I am just nodding my head constantly when you speak, Gina, because I've seen it work time and time again.
Same
and now,
here.
yes. So Karen, do we have time to share a harder, a difficult decision that wasn't so pretty in the end?
Yes.
Do we have just,
Please.
okay. So
Please.
one time, this one sticks with me even to this day. I had pulled aside a candidate, well, all of them, and they had the meetings to share the data on how they performed on the admission criteria. Dispositions was but one of the assessments at admission. And this one particular candidate had already begun the program, and there were some red flags. But in the meeting, when I shared the evidence of performance on the admission criteria and the dispositional instrument, the student became so agitated with me. I actually felt unsafe. And with a intense look in his eye, he looked at me and he said, I knew it. I knew you'd never let me in because my grandfather was a member of a secret society. And your institution I knew your institution would never let a grandchild of someone from a secret society to be in teacher education. And I said, no, I can assure you, here are the rubrics. This is the performance. This is how the decision was made. And he went on and on so much, left my office agitated. It was unsettling at best. He went on to go to the local courthouse to sue the institution and suggest, he demanded that he be placed in the teacher education program. I don't even know how that can come to be, but I do remember when I was called for a deposition, I think that's the right word, when the attorney for the university said, okay, Dr. Ingles, tell us what instruments were used at admission. Is everyone assessed on those instruments? And then I shared, yes, everyone is assessed on those instruments. And let me tell you about the validity and reliability of each. And so I put forth all of that information. I had a wonderful paper trail, our school did, that we had followed the protocols. And the case, of course, it was just dismissed. It was just dismissed. But can you imagine how our school and university was just breathed a sigh of relief? One, that we weren't liable in the courts. Two, that a candidate who was clearly unstable did not progress in the program to the point we would have placed him with children. So that for me makes me an even louder cheerleader of dispositional assessments. They're so critical to our selection process.
Excellent. Thank you both. That was excellent. Our last question, we have a Q&A, but there's one last question we'd like to ask. How can we demonstrate that candidates value diversity and are equitable and inclusive in their practices? Sally?
Well, I immediately think of how we structure our programs. If we say we value diversity, if we say we celebrate diversity, is that how we are practicing and designing our programs? Are we placing our candidates in settings where they are exposed to children of various diversities? I'll just say that. And are we coming alongside and helping the candidates differentiate and reach and value those children they serve? So I think that's it. We need to practice what we preach. We say we value it. Let's put our candidates in settings where they can encounter diversity and learn how to successfully serve children of diverse backgrounds.
Excellent. Thank you. Gina.
And it comes so much into this whole concept of culturally responsive teaching, seeing children's differences as their strengths and coming from that mindset. But one of the things I would also like to add is that in whatever type of disposition tool or measure you are using, it must be included in your disposition assessment. There must be in that tool an expectation that your students are embracing all diversities, as evidenced by planning and implementing activities and behaviors with the goal of inclusiveness, and inclusiveness across so many different points of reference: cultural, ethnic, cognitive. So I would recommend that it is in a dispositional tool that you specifically address the importance of valuing diversity.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both. That was the end of our formal questions. Is there anything either one of you want to add on before I go to the Q&A?
Nothing comes to mind.
Okay, so let me go to the Q&A. This is from Mary, who is asking, can you suggest materials we can use to help remediate candidates who do poorly on such assessments?
Well, Karen, I had written a workbook years ago just to support my candidates going through the process. So I'm sorry, that's the only thing I can think of right now. It's truly just an interactive workbook where there are exercises about human interaction or critical thinking or even leadership. So that's what comes to mind. I'm not trying, I even think it's out of print, but that's what comes to mind.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness, I'm thinking right in the top of my head now. Culturally responsive teaching in the brain, Zaretta Hammond's book. Springer's book on social emotional learning and the brain. Anything that deals with neuroscience, social emotional learning, or culturally responsive teaching, because all of those behaviors that they talk about, all those important decisions that they talk about that deal with relationships, it all comes back to dispositions. So those are just a couple I think about, but I think importantly, faculty and the climate in your institution, in your division, in your department, in your college, the faculty must embrace the concept of dispositions and demonstrate and model dispositions, effective dispositions for their students. Bring in good children's literature and talk about how did this experience, how did this candidate feel? I mean, how did this child feel, or how did this character feel, and why did they feel that way, and how would you feel if you were in that situation? And just, bringing in those types of resources, I'm just again off the top of my head, might help.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you both so very, very much for sharing such thought-filled, research-based, experiential answers to these questions on a difficult topic, difficult area to assess. But you've shown us it can be done, and it should be done. And to quote you, Sally, early and often.
Mhm.
So, and I think you both have agreed with that. It's at the entry point. As soon as we meet our candidates, they should understand these dispositions. So I thank you very, very much for giving us your time this afternoon. And for, oh, I have another question. 1 minute. And a thank you. It's a thank you. So, and it's another one. Thank you for a great session. The disposition story gave me chills.
It was our pleasure. It was my pleasure. Thank you, Karen and Amy.
Mine too. Mine too.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amy, did you want to do some
Sure,
housekeeping
yes,
here?
Yes, so thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And I just wanted to remind everyone that the next session begins at 2:50. If you are a presenter, feel free to log in at 2:45, but I hope to see many of you. We have 2 more sessions, so 2:50, I hope you join us. And thank you so much, Sally, Gina, and Karen. Wonderful. So, okay,
Thank
have a
you.
wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.